Welcome everyone to the 2021 Fall Nimbutsu Seminar, which is sponsored by the Honolulu and Oahu Hongaji Councils and the Office of Buddhist Education. As of the last registration count, we counted 83 registrants for today's seminar, which is a really large number, and we're really excited to have so many of you here. I know that the participants list, I'm sure, will continue to grow this morning. We have people registered from temples and other entities across Hawaii, of course, but also California, Minnesota, Texas. We just met someone who's here on the island, but a resident of just finished college in Houston. So really excited to welcome all of you this morning. If I can take a moment to introduce myself, my name is Josh Hernandez Morris, and I am the head of school at Pacific Buddhist Academy, or PBA, an independent high school of some 80 students that is located on the temple campus of the Honpahoengangi Hawaii Betsuim, which is itself nestled on the slope of the Punch Bowl Crater or Puawaina, which is the place name given it by Native Hawaiians. I have been a teacher at PBA since we launched the school in 2003, and it has been my great privilege since being here to be welcomed to the community of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism in Hawaii, Japan, and the US mainland. I'm very grateful to the Honolulu and Oahu Hongaji Councils and to the Office of Buddhist Education to have been invited as one of two facilitators for this seminar, whose theme, Mindfulness in Today's World. And by today's world, the seminar's organizers hoped Reverend Matt would speak to challenges facing members of communities like LGBTQIA+, Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, and Black Lives Matter. That theme is of deep interest to my school Sangha. I'm very pleased also to be joined in facilitating this seminar by an alumna of PBA, Koki Atchison, and she will introduce herself later this morning. So thank you again so much for being here with us. If I can ask Reverend David Fujimoto, the resident minister of Mililani and Ewa Honganji, to please offer for us an aspiration.
Thank you very much. Please join me in a moment of reflection with your palms put together in Gassho. This morning, we come together in the spirit of Sangha for this joint Honolulu Oahu Nembutsu seminar. We thank all from around the US for joining us today. We also thank our speaker, Reverend Matt Hamasaki, for taking the time out of his busy schedule to speak with us today. From the workbook for spiritual development, an adapted aspiration to contemplate on. May our hearts be pure, harmonious, and peaceful. May great truth flourish and our worldly work be prosperous and not be affected by evil. May all aspirations be conferred. May its benefits abundantly aid our being, and may we always be sheltered by infinite wisdom and incomprehensible compassion. To end, let us all recite the three treasures together. I go to the Buddha for guidance. I go to the Dharma for guidance. I go to the Sangha for guidance. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
Thank you, Reverend Fujimoto, for your aspiration and for the kind embrace of your words. Just a few housekeeping matters before I introduce our keynote speaker. Following Reverend Matt Hamasaki's presentation, we will take a short 5-minute break so viewers and participants can refresh themselves. And after this, we will start a segment of questions and answers, as well as hopefully have an opportunity to hear from some individuals who are kind enough to share experiences of discrimination in their own lives. You will be welcome to unmute and chat openly during that segment, but during Reverend Matt's presentation, we ask that you leave your audio on mute and that you save any questions that come to mind for the Q&A segment. You could also put some questions as they come to mind in the chat box that's available here in Zoom. And now let me please introduce Reverend Matt Hamasaki. Reverend Matt Hamasaki grew up in Berkeley, California, where he attended the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. His interest in the Dharma began there, nurtured by his Dharma school teachers and deepening during his high school years when he was active in the junior YBA. After graduating, he received his Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from the University of California, Davis, and went on to receive his Master's in Buddhism from the Institute of Buddhist Studies. He was first assigned to the Central California District and then transferred to the Sacramento Betsuin, where he is currently the interim Renban, as well as supervising minister for the Florin and Placer Buddhist churches. Please welcome Reverend Matt Hamasaki.
Thank you. Can everyone see it okay? Yes, okay, all right, good. Okay, so mindfulness in today's world was the topic that was given to me to speak about. Or in other words, what on earth is going on in the mainland? So, there's probably some, I guess, kind of a buffer there between what's going on here and what's going on in Hawaii. I'm sure you hear about it, but, don't really know what's going on. So first, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement for the Sacramento area. So recognizing that we are on native land taken from the Nisean people, the Maidu people, the Miwok people, and the Patwin Wintu people. Okay, so I'm going to go real quick. Each of these issues that was assigned are very deep and could take easily multiple sessions to go over. So if you'd like to go more in depth on race in America, and you like how I present things, I gave another presentation for the Venice Honganji. And if you check out their website on YouTube or their YouTube page, then you can find my my lecture there. Anyway, so it's going to go real quick. If you have any questions or anything, I encourage you to write them down or put them in the chat, and then we can get to them in the next session. So yeah, it's going to go real fast. Okay, so real quick, we're going to start with the creation of race in America. So this starts with colonists taking native lands and bringing indentured servants and slaves over. So originally, right, in America, there was the Native Americans, then colonists came over, bringing with them their ways. So these indentured servants and slaves were both European and African laborers. Eventually, though, the number of laborers became great enough that they posed a real threat to the landowners. So they outnumbered them when they were all together, and so it became like a threat. So a form of social control was created, which was rooted in race. So this is actually the creation of the white race. So those who are racialized white were treated better than those racialized black. And so the wording here is kind of confusing, but what happened was there's these people who are racialized white. So they're seen as white, but they're not like the landowners. They're also kind of in the lower stratums of society where they're like doing service jobs, they're indentured servants. And those people, because they were racialized white, who were also the landowners were also racialized white, they felt more connected to the people at the top, the people who had all the wealth, than to the people who were racialized black, who were much closer in economic standing to them. So even though they were more similar to them, they felt closer to the people who were wealthy. In that way, it was able to break up them coming together and keep them kind of in line. So this is kind of a key here where the root of racism is at its heart, one of colonialism and greed. Its creation is a result of the wealthiest creating a system which would keep as such by turning those who would benefit from banding together against each other. So there could have been real change if those, the poor whites had bonded with the blacks and then overthrew the system that was keeping them all into this really these two separate kind of systems. However, they broke it up so that they would align themselves with the wealthier, and so they weren't able to have that kind of meaningful change. Now, there's two things I wanted to bring attention, is that there's individual or interpersonal racism as well as institutional racism. So when people think of racism, they usually think of like a racist thing that one person does to another, whether it's, like verbal abuse, physical abuse, but racism is also institutionalized in rules, laws, and principles in government or business that favor one group over another. And I'll explain that with this next slide, which I'll go really quickly to the next slide. So there's these different gaps between these things, which will be illustrated in these very nice images from Ben & Jerry's. So who knew that ice cream companies doing the real hard work of trying to get people together. So here we have in this first top left corner, this wealth gap where whites are 77% of the population, but they have 90% of the wealth, whereas African Americans are 13% of the population and have 2.6% of the wealth. So there's this huge gap there in terms of population versus wealth. Common American practice is to build generational wealth through home ownership, so you can pass that down to your kids. 72% of white Americans own homes compared to 42% of Black Americans. Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed, and there's actually a study done that if a Black person has a white-sounding name, they are 50% more likely to get a call back for an interview. Black students are 3 times more than likely than white students to be suspended for the same infractions. Blacks make up 13% of the general population, but they make up 40% of the prison population. And let's see, finally, life expectancy of Black men and women is lower than white Americans. This is like a healthcare issue because lack of high quality options, Black babies die at almost 2.5 times more than white babies. So these are examples of institutional racism, and they all kind of overlap and feed into each other. So if you don't have wealth, if you don't have a home, it's hard to get a job. If you don't have a job, it's hard to get a home. If you don't get a good education, it's hard to, make money. It's hard to get a job. If you're in prison, you're less likely to get employed. And then, of course, if you die early, then there's really nothing that you can do. So all of these things influence each other, and they're all built into different parts of our country in whether it's, like I said, government things, whether it's the law, whether it's just policies that people have or things that color their view. So now I'm going to go over a couple things. So in 2012 was the Trayvon Martin case. If you're unfamiliar with it, I encourage you to look it up. That too, I could do a whole presentation on, but during and following the trial, it's important because this is where the Black Lives Matter term began getting coined and it became popular. Then in 2019, George Floyd was murdered. And so if you're unfamiliar with that case, again, I encourage you to look it up. This led to worldwide protests against police brutality, police racism, and police accountability. And it revitalized this Black Lives Matter movement, which this phrase is a response to the reality that historically Black lives have not mattered. So oftentimes the argument against this is like, well, don't all lives matter? And it's like, well, yes, except Black lives are treated as though they don't matter. And so this is a reminder that Black lives do matter, that we have to actually do something to show that they matter. Again, going back to this root of racism, it's at its core one of colonialism and greed. It's the creation of the wealthy, creating a system which would keep it as such by turning those who benefit from banding together against each other. Okay, so that's one down. So racism against people of Asian descent is not new on the mainland. So Asian immigrant communities across the country have suffered from poverty, segregation, and discrimination essentially since they had come over to America. The 60s, after, so they've been here for, the Japanese and Chinese, the longest for about, a little over 100 years, but the 60s saw the rise of the anti-Vietnam War movement, Black Power movement, and the American Indian movement. So this was the climate that UC Berkeley grad students, Emma G and Yuji Ichioka, they had a student organization and they named it the Asian American Political Alliance, which is, as historians has accepted, the first public use of the term Asian American. So before this, there was no term Asian American, this blanket term for people of that Asian descent. They would actually define themselves by the country of origin. So in Ichioka's words, there were so many Asians out there in the political demonstration, but we had no effectiveness. Everyone was lost in a larger rally. We figured that if we rallied behind our own banner, behind the Asian American banner, we would have an effect on the larger public. We could extend influence beyond ourselves to other Asian Americans. So it really was a political move on their part to try to create more change within America. So it was a response. It was a response to many different shared issues, in that it helped combat derogatory language. So before this, they were called Oriental in a derogatory way. Helped to create a bond through a shared experience of immigrants and xenophobia. They bonded over anti-Asian violence, and they, of course, increased their political power as a larger voting group. So just as kind of a aside, in the 1980s, the term Pacific Islander was used in the US Census Bureau in order to categorize those from the Pacific Islands. So when they came over to America, they weren't really sure what to do with them in terms of counting. And so they encompassed them all. And this was backed by some Asian American groups to combine forces, again, to have this kind of leverage in the political scene. However, in 2000, API became two separate racial categories. And so while this isn't necessarily related to that, keeping Pacific Islander as part of the API can be problematic. So it ends up being erasure for the Pacific Islander experience. There's little to no representation of the Pacific Islanders, little to no work done in the Pacific Islander community. So I'm not sure if anyone has been following the API, Stop API Hate, the kind of events that people put on, whether on Zoom or in person. And a lot of the people they have as speakers, as representatives, they're from places like, or they have countries of descent from like China, from Japan, from Korea, these kind of larger Eastern Asian places. But how often, do you see people from the Pacific Islands being represented in these kind of organizational things that get organized events? And there's these AAPI communities or organizations, oftentimes they'll keep it on as a label to be inclusive, but in terms of really representing, putting them in leadership positions or doing work in the Pacific Islander Committee, a lot of times it's lacking. Anyway, going back now. So with COVID-19, the blame of the coronavirus was placed squarely on China, and anti-China political rhetoric actually continues to be prevalent in the media, regardless of administration or even if it's coronavirus related, which causes people to attack those who appear to be Chinese. And thus, this was the rise of the Stop AAPI Hate movement. The community was encouraged to report incidents, as Asians were typically quiet on such matters. It's kind of keep your head down and don't, make any noise. So the data being collected by organizations like Stop AAPI Hate to better represent the problem when presented to bodies like Congress or reporting or something. So again, it's kind of an aside. It's very a specific definition of hate when it comes to hate crimes. And so it's important to recognize that while everything reported might be racist in some way, they don't all necessarily get categorized as hate crimes. And so it's hard to rely on data from police departments or something. So this is another way to be able to represent the problem a bit better. Okay, all right, number 3. So LGBTQIA plus issues in America, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. So there's been a lot of progress done, in the past probably 50 years, but there's still plenty of work to do. And actually, Hawaii, as I did some research, is has been very progressive in terms of these issues. However, in the greater America, there's still a lot that needs to be done. So one of these things is violence. Almost 1 in 5 hate crimes reported are from anti-LGBTQ bias. So last year, there was this tragic new record of fatal violence against transgender and non-gender conforming people. They particularly against Black and brown transgender women. So 9 out of 10 LGBTQ students reported being harassed and bullied. Over 1/3 of LGBTQ students are physically assaulted because of sexual orientation. About 2/3 of LGBTQ students reported having ever been sexually harassed in the past year, and 26 states have no anti-bullying laws protecting LGBTQ students based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Gay conversion therapy, which is still a thing apparently. So in the past, the APA actually had homosexuality as a diagnosable mental illness up until 1973. So because of that, there was something called reparative therapy, which exists to cure people of this so-called disease called homosexuality. And the impact of that, as many of them were sent as children, is that LGBTQ children sent to reparative therapy are 8.5 or almost 8.5 times more likely to attempt suicide and almost 6 times more likely to stay depressed. So there's 22 states that have no state or law saying that this is not illegal. Housing. 18 states don't have any laws prohibiting housing discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So they could not sell a house or give an apartment based solely on their sexual orientation. Parenting. Same-sex couples are not automatically legal guardians in all. So in some, they have to adopt their children after they're born, adding extra hurdles and costs to being a parent. And currently 19 states have no explicit protections against discrimination and adoption based on sexual orientation or gender identity. healthcare. So sexual minorities are twice as likely as straight people to be insured. When they are insured, they may not have some coverage for fertility options. So because they're a gay couple, they don't have the same fertility options. And then currently 27 states have no law providing LGBTQ inclusive insurance protections. So healthcare in mainland America essentially is really bad for everyone, but it's especially bad for the LGBTQ people. Transgender bathroom laws, which has been kind of a hot button topic lately. And while this seems very specific, it actually represents the right of any American to public accommodations. So that means safe access to goods, services, facilities, and privileges in the public sphere. And currently 22 states have no anti-discrimination laws for public accommodations. So, I mean, obviously that includes bathrooms, but that's really just anything that is public that anyone can appreciate, can be able to use. There's no protection for that. So they could be denied any of those things. So again, there's many more issues that need to be addressed. However, for the sake of time, I have only highlighted these issues previously. Okay, so I think that was all three. So Reverend Fujimoto, you owe me a trip to Hawaii. Let's see. So now going into the Buddhist aspect of it. So
anytime, buddy, anytime.
The Jodo Shinshu approach, my appreciation of Jodo Shinshu is that it's a very personal religion. So we all have to look within ourselves to see how we are these limited beings, meaning we're imperfect, right? We can't know everything, we can't see everything, we can't understand everything. And because of that, we cause suffering for ourselves and for others. However, even though we are these limited beings that are imperfect, that are causing suffering for everybody around us, still our causes and conditions cause us to be the recipient of infinite wisdom and compassion that sustains us. So infinite wisdom and compassion is, of course, another name for our object of reverence, Amida Buddha, right? That's our altar. But Amida Buddha isn't one person. It isn't a god up in the sky throwing down lightning bolts. Amida Buddha is all around us, right? The people who are taking care of us, that teach us, that help us, even people who are maybe our enemies or people we don't like. They're teaching us in some way. And we have to recognize that we are the recipient of all that compassion all the time. And after we recognize that, the next step, I think, is to recognize that we are also part of this fabric of life that connects us all. So we're not just this individual being. In seeing how we are the recipient of so many amazing things, we recognize that we're connected, not just to those things, but to everyone, to everything. And after this insight and gratitude, we need to turn our actions to reflect that relationship. So I heard this one thing that, insight is quick, but change is long. So we have this insight where, oh yeah, you know what? I'm not so great. I'm actually, sometimes kind of a jerk, but still, all these nice things, like people are good to me. They help me out. And so what can I do, to reflect that? What can I do with my actions to show that even though I'm this imperfect being, still, I should be out helping? And another way of understanding this would be this term for karma. So a lot of times people think karma is this thing where you do something good and then later on something good will happen to you, or do something bad will happen to you. But that's more like bachi. So karma is really just action. And in physics, it would be that, for every action, there is a reaction. So something happens, something else is going to happen. And one of the questions that was posed to me was that, what do we do for people who hate? How do we show compassion to those people? And my response would be not to try to educate or change them, right? If you try to argue with someone, you try to change their mind, you try to push your views on someone, that's just going to make them more upset. And then you might get upset and then you'll be going at it. And so it just kind of continues to perpetuate this negative energy, this unhappiness. And rather, I would suggest to forgive them. And in that way, the karma stops. So someone is putting out, this bad karma into the world. And if you forgive them, then it stops it from being then perpetuated, from being reflected, from continuing. It stops it there. And so you're showing them this compassion because you're stopping their bad karma. It reminds me of this story of our teacher's teacher. So Shinan Shonin, his teacher Honen, how he became a monk. So his father, Honen's father, ended up being some kind of like city magistrate or something. And he was killed. He was murdered, probably assassinated. And it's said in legend that his father, with his dying breath, told Honen, don't get revenge. Don't think about it. Just go and become a monk. And so that's why he ended up becoming a monk, right? Created Jodo Shu and was able to teach our teacher Shinan Shoni. And that's why we're even here today. So I think that this idea of not going out for revenge, not trying to strike back, and in the same way, not trying to like educate or change people who are hating, who are doing these terrible things. That's the most compassionate and the most, I think, Jodo Shinshu or Buddhist way of looking at it. Instead, I think it's important to turn to those who are disadvantaged. So when I was talking about, we look at how we're connected to all beings, we see all these people who we are connected to. It's important for us to then look to those who are maybe not doing as good as we are. So continuing on again with this idea of karma, karma as we understand it is linear. So we think it's one thing. We're like, okay, here's my past, here's my present, here's my future. Something in the past affects something in the present, which affects something in the future. And it's just one straight line. It's easy for us to understand. But ultimately, karma is nonlinear. Things that exist in the past still influence things happening today, which is influencing things in the future. So it's not that they all exist separately, but they all kind of exist in the same time, the same place. So and understanding karma in this way, if you see people suffering and you're in a position to help, you don't want to focus on their karmic past, but you focus on your karmic opportunity in the present. So you don't look at them and like, oh, what's wrong with them? But you look at only yourself and what you can do to help that person. So you may be in the same position. And I don't mean you specifically right now, who you are right now, but you could be in the past or in the future. And not even necessarily you, this person that, you call your name. Maybe it's your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Maybe it's your children or your great-grandchildren. Maybe they will be in the same position as this person that you see who is suffering. And in that way, when you see it that way, that they're all connected in that way, that when you offer compassion to someone who is suffering, you're actually really doing compassion to yourself. And it's not to say that, I'm trying to keep you in this kind of small box of, a person, but in Buddhism, it's trying to teach us to shatter that ego, shatter that duality of you and I, of us and them, of, one and then two. Really, it's all one thing. So when you're compassionate to anyone, when you're compassionate to anyone, especially someone, who is suffering, then ultimately that's compassion for yourself. Okay. So I wanted to blow through that real quick because another question that was asked was, can you make this talk relevant to Hawaii? And I will do my best because I received that question, I think about 4 days ago. So I've had 4 days to try to figure out how to make this relevant to Hawaii. And as a disclaimer, I want to just let everyone know that I don't claim to know anything about life in Hawaii. I can only speak from what I've learned from, my reading in books or on the internet. So, I'm going to come in here and I want people to be thinking like, oh yeah, what's this like Katonka to tell us about being local over here? So really, I'm trying to do my best not to, say anything that, like I'm trying to tell you how you live or tell you what you should be doing, but just my kind of understanding from what I was able to gather in the short period of time. So instead of conflict between races, in Hawaii, there's conflict between ethnicities. And this can be traced back to the sugar plantations. So originally, sugar was enjoyed by the native Hawaiian people, but it eventually ended up becoming a prospective export. So something that could help the Kingdom of Hawaii financially by being able to export it and then get economic gains that way. Now, the initial mills were inefficient and they didn't pay any dividends. It lost a lot of money. And so in order to create a profitable product, massive capital was necessary, more than any individual could come up with. So instead of people owning the mills for sugar, it ended up being partnerships in the form of limited liability corporations, and they were able to invest. Also, there was plenty of different things that could go wrong, which necessitated frequent large cash infusions, which was done by things called agencies or agents, which was able to manage that level of credit. So eventually, these agents replaced the original investors as bankers, as well as managing day-to-day operations. And after the implanters incurred so much debt to these agents, they became just flat out, straight up owners as well. So, in the history, these are known as the Big Five for King Sugar. So, with the agents taking over, they were able to have access to a lot more funds, which they purchased more efficient machinery with. And with this new machinery, it needed more manpower. So native Hawaiians before had not worked for money, but they worked as kind of like a labor tax to the chieftains in the area for living there. They weren't accustomed to this concept of working to the bone for someone else to profit. They were, they would think to themselves, look, I can just go live off the land with my family. It's a lot better work. It's a lot more peaceful life. And so they were resistant and eventually went on strike. The plantations then looked to other sources of labor outside of the native Hawaiians. The first that they sought out were the Chinese, as China at the time was politically and economically volatile. Now, the conditions were just a little bit better than slavery. So they worked 26 days a month, over 10 hours a day, and there was overseers known as Luna that would ride on horsebacks with whips. The laborers were subject to what is known as master and servant law. So what that meant was absenteeism or refusal to work would lead to apprehension from a police officer or a district magistrate, and punishment would be additional time on the contract that they signed. Refusal to serve was resulted in jail and hard labor until eventually they gave in and ended up having to work it out anyway. So the Chinese in Hawaii, when their labor was needed, they were thought of as quiet, skillful, obedient, patient, quick to learn. However, when they left the plantation and entered the open labor market or went into business, they were condemned as murderer, cutthroat, selfish, thieves, cunning. And so between 1850 and 1900, there was about 46,000 Chinese that came to Hawaii. But one of the problems was they were almost exclusively male. So in 1884, they were 22% of the population and held 49% of plantation field jobs. However, by 1932, they mostly left plantation work. So one of the big things that helped the sugar industry was the 1876 Sugar Reciprocity Treaty. So this allowed Hawaiian sugar to be tariff-free in the US where other ones weren't. And so it made sugar from Hawaii very competitive. And I think it also had some kind of, when they would need certain amount of sugar from Hawaii to be brought in. So again, there was this need for labor, and it was sought out to find cheap labor that wouldn't be able to assert itself. Quotas, that's what it was. All right, so then they imported people from countries such as Portugal, Japan, Korea, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So they preyed on the poor farming communities in that these countries were going through also these kind of crises that would affect the farming community that allowed them to then, entice them to come over to Hawaii. So with Portugal as an example, there was a wine blight caused by this aphid, essentially, that destroyed the plants. And it ruined a lot of the farming community there that was in the wine industry. And so they were brought over to Hawaii. Now, the Japanese in Hawaii, they came during the Meiji Restoration, which was rapid urbanization, industrialization, which caused social disruption and agricultural decline. So there was this huge exodus from the farming communities to the large cities. The people who were farmers were forced to leave their land. The workers who worked on the farms were left jobless to foreign competition as Japan was opening up for the first time. And the wages dropped and opportunities outside the nation were difficult to ignore. So of all the groups brought
you okay if I work on wiping the phone?
Of all the groups brought in plantation labor, the largest was from Japan with over 80,000 just before 1900. So eventually, though, the Picture Bride era brought in females. So before it was mostly male workers. And as there was females coming in, then they began to have families in Hawaii. This isn't to say with these terrible conditions that there weren't any kind of challenges. There were these so-called labor disturbances. And there was this legal case of Hilo Sugar versus Miyoshi. And Miyoshi argued that involuntary servitude was prohibited under the Kingdom of Hawaii's constitution. But the court upheld the law. And then there's also this person, Katsugoto, who finished out his contract and remained on the island to start a small business. But of course, these other companies, they did not take kindly to there being competition, especially not one done by a foreigner. And so he was on his way to get some help with the English translation, and he ended up getting lynched. Any real change was prevented by creating and maintaining an ethnic hierarchy. So this process was kind of this divide and rule. Hierarchy was based on the country of origin and then the time of the immigration to foster jealousy. So what that meant was there was a staggered wage based on ethnic seniority for the same work. So if you had the same work, then the Portuguese would be paid one thing, a little bit lower would be Chinese, a little bit lower would be Japanese, and so on and so forth. And so by having these different wages for the same work, it created physical altercations. Not only that, but they also lived in camps separated by country of origin, later arrivals being built further from center. So they're actually, the plantations worked hard to make sure that there wasn't any intermingling even before they got on the boat. And then when they got here, that they were put in their own camps. And when there was new people coming from a different country, then they built another camp, and it was further from the center where everything was happening. And so again, this also fostered this kind of jealousy. It didn't stop there though. The separation also applied to recreational sports teams, to nurseries, to public school classrooms. All of these things were separate based on country of origin. So there's evidence that this worked because there was labor strikes that were organized by the Japanese because of the conditions. However, they failed because they were unwilling to solicit support from Filipino workers who had come in later. And so they didn't want to include them in trying to do this labor strike. So the plantation owners just brought in all the Filipino people as scabs. Eventually, the ethnicities did end up working together though. So there was unions beginning to form, but then, like in the 30s, but then World War II led to martial law in Hawaii, and the sudden stop of any movement of wages were frozen, contracts were suspended, and then workers were actually forbidden to change jobs without the permission of their employer. So once they were able to resume though, union organizers each had a camp, assign a leader who was then recruited and then trained. And whenever a president of a group was elected, the vice president was required to be of a different ethnicity. So this way it was built in that there wasn't going to be one powerful group, that everyone would be represented. A greater labor movement in America allowed educational opportunities on the West Coast for organizers in Hawaii. So people from Hawaii would travel to the West Coast. They would go to these places that were like labor schools, essentially. They would be taught about labor laws, how to organize, how to effectively strike, and then they brought that knowledge back to Hawaii. Following the war, they put what they learned into practice, and they won a huge victory in the sugar strike of 1946. But then sugar left. So there's a couple reasons why it left. One of the things was these effective unions actually made the industry less competitive. Land values began to spike with the introduction of passenger jet planes. So with the introduction of that, then there was this tourism boom. And so landowners found it much more profitable with hotels than with sugarcane. Also, the treaty that was signed earlier ended up expiring. And so there wasn't these quotas that were being pulled in from Hawaii, and made it also tough for sugar. So sugar left, and Hawaii moved into more of this tourism economy. So then, everyone was cool, right? Well, that depends on your definition. So Hawaii is hailed, right, as this place that doesn't have any racial discrimination, that it's this like big, mixed plate of everybody, that they all get together along, everyone's kind to each other, they all have aloha, which is great as an attitude. But what are the tangible things that show that everyone is doing well in Hawaii? So in order to find some kind of tangible information, let's look at some graphs. So this is from a document published in 2018 by the state of Hawaii's Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. So here's the median household income by race group. So you have that total population median with that black line. You see there's some above it, and then there's some below it. So the Okinawan, Guamanian, the Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, they're all higher than the median income. So the people who are, getting a lot of money are from those kind of, ethnicities. Below them are the Marshallese, Vietnamese, like Korean, Tongan. Here's per capita income by race group. So the income for the total population per capita would be about $30,000. The only ones above that are the Okinawan, the Japanese, and the white. Everyone else is below, especially the Marshallese, Samoan, the Tongan. Families who live in poverty by race group. So in all of Hawaii, it's 11.2% for the total population. White kind of reflects the same number. There's less in poverty for Filipino, Japanese, for Chinese, for Okinawan, Guamanian, but then much more when you look at the Marshallese. Almost half of them are in poverty. Vietnamese, American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Tongan, Samoan, 20%. A lot of them, like 1 in 5, the Samoan people live in poverty. Educational attainment, population aged 25 and older by race group. So when it comes to a graduate professional degree, the total population is about 10%, where it's very heavily represented by the white population, by Japanese, by Chinese, Korean, and then Okinawan. Bachelor's degree, almost 1 in 3 Okinawan people and 1 in 4 Japanese people have at least a bachelor's degree. So the white people are represented higher than the state's average. And then, of course, there's ones that are much lower, the Marshallese, Samoan, Guamanian, Tongan, all around 11%, Native Hawaiian, around 11%. As far as these other ones, we can get to those, but if you want to look at less than high school, 9%, whereas there's very few white people who have only less than a high school diploma, whereas it's much more represented by Filipino, the Vietnamese, Marshallese, those communities. Home ownership. The total population, a little more than half the people have homes, but overwhelmingly the Japanese and the Okinawan people, most of them, almost 3 out of 4 Japanese or Okinawan people have homes, whereas the Chinese people a little bit less. Filipino is about half, and then you see these other groups that are much lower. So as I was looking at this, I was thinking to myself, why did the Japanese Americans end up being so successful after the war, after sugar left? And so the narrative for Japanese Americans has been that hard work and focus on education have been the reason why Japanese Americans are so successful, which, there's a lot of professionals in the Japanese American community on the mainland too. And so that also has been the narrative. But is it that, or is it good luck and timing? So it's probably both. So at the end of the war, it included the GI Bill, which made education affordable for the Nisei veterans. Some became professionals, some became involved in government, some became political figures. The 1952 Immigration Act, which happened after the war, gave the Issei eligibility for citizenship and the right to participate. So there's these different things that allowed the Japanese Americans to get educations, then to become professionals, get good jobs, and also get jobs in the government and in politics. And I think those are all important things. But to me, at least from my research, what it seemed like the biggest thing was that there was just so many Japanese people. So not only did over 150,000 Japanese people come to America, but apparently the birth rate of the Issei was staggering. So it was just off the charts, the amount of babies that they were having. And I guess this is normal sometimes for immigrant communities, for them to have a lot of kids. But what that meant is that when the Nisei came of age, which they did about this time, it created this huge political bloc, basically a majority. So that way they could greatly influence policies with their vote because there were so many of them. So this, coupled with the tourism industry's need for professional workers and investments that the Japanese people made, it led to economic and political rise. So as the tourism industry started to take root in Hawaii, there was this need for professional workers. And as it began, there was huge job growth, which, eventually petered out. But the jobs were there for all these people who had just recently become professionals. So it was like great timing. On top of this, the family makeup changed as more women worked within the family, and then the daughters of families were also encouraged to pursue higher education, where previously, they were encouraged to be homemakers, not work, not to get that higher education. But now, with having two people who were bringing in an income and also setting up, their children to have higher education to get better jobs, and it set them up for success. There was intermarriage with following generations. So there's acceptance also of the local culture. And so this opened up the Sansei to all of Hawaii's issues. So they're much more, aware of the other communities, but they still maintain this identity of Japanese Americans. And they still had people in positions of authority and power within the government, within the judiciary, and in politics. So they were also able to build on wealth generated from previous generations to pass on to the next, which is not just money, but investing in education as early as preschool and paying for grad school. So after the war, they were able to get good educations, they were able to get good jobs, and then they were also able to influence a lot of policy. From that, though, they were able to buy houses. Like we see, home ownership is one of the ways that you can pass down wealth. With that kind of wealth, you can then invest in your children's education, which again will lead to better jobs, which will lead to more money, which will lead to this kind of cycle. So is it their fault? Of course not. I want to make it very clear that I'm not blaming anyone for what's going on in Hawaii, that it's not like any one person's fault or one group's fault or anything. The Japanese were just trying to help their kids have a better life, which is every parent's wish, is for their kids to be happy, for them to have a better life than they have, especially when you're immigrants, you're coming from this really difficult place, the hardships that were happening in Japan. They wanted their kids not to have to worry about those things. And so they were just trying to give them a better life. But are there unintended consequences? Absolutely. On top of other circumstances that maintain ethnic equality. So again, it's not like Japanese people are racist against other ethnicities, or, they're discriminating against other ethnicities. That's not what's going on. It's this institutional inequality. So the institutional equality, like I was mentioning, with mainland America, there's all these different things that kind of overlap, where if you come to Hawaii, if you aren't already established, it's hard to get a good job. And if you can't get a good job, then you can't own a house, you can't develop wealth, and you can't pass it on to your children, which then completely perpetuates the cycle. So this is caused by many different policies, practices, and laws, which denies ethnic minorities the same opportunities and privileges enjoyed by dominant ethnic groups. So two big things that we can look at are employment and education. So with employment, it's difficult to have upward mobility within the tourism industry. It's said that it creates a lot of jobs, and there are a lot of people are employed in the tourism industry. And that's true, but a lot of these jobs are low wage. They have no opportunities for them to move up. And so they're stuck at this kind of place, no matter how long they've been there or how hard they work. And the other thing, which is kind of related as well, is education. So, if you don't want this low paying job, you have to have a good education. However, education, public school education in Hawaii has been declining since I think the 70s. So the budget has been cut for them. So the schools are deteriorating. The classroom sizes are getting huge. There aren't any teachers. I mean, especially not being trained on the islands, they had to bring the teachers in from the mainland. But education is very bad in the public schools. And so where you get a good education is either you have to live in a very influential community, or you pay to send your kid to private school. And by being able to have that kind of wealth or money to do that, then you ensure that your child is going to be able to get a good education, that they're going to be able to get into a good school, that they'll be able to get a higher education, and then be put into a better job. So then they get put into this professional job, either within the tourism industry or somewhere else. But either way, they get a good job because their parents were able to pay for their education. Where on the opposite side of it, again, if you are in this low paying job, you can barely afford your rent. How are you going to send your kids to private school? They have to go to public school. They go to public school. The dropout rate is very high. The education they get is not very good. They get, kids get held back. There's all these things going wrong with the education system. They're not going to get a good education. They're not going to get into a good school. They're not going to get higher education. So they're going to be stuck going into a low paid job. They're not going to be going into a higher professional or something with upward mobility. They're going to be stuck in that kind of job, thus perpetuating the cycle. It's institutionalized within the economy, the government of Hawaii. So, you see this also not just in the public school, but in higher education. University of Hawaii has been raising tuition for, however many years. And because of that, it becomes more and more difficult for people who do not have a lot of money to get that good education, which would then lead them to success that would help them create that intergenerational wealth. Okay, so that's my presentation. Again, as kind of a disclaimer, I don't know anything about Hawaii. I can only speak about, what I've learned in my reading. I'm not trying to tell anyone that they're bad people, that they, need to start doing something that, like the way you're living is wrong or anything. I'm not trying to say any of that. I'm just trying to present this kind of information that I was able to learn, whether or not, like it's true. You guys live it. It's not me, right? So I wanted to make that clear that I was just trying to represent something, try to make it kind of relevant to Hawaiian as I was asked, even though my knowledge of it is very, very limited. But I wanted to bring it back to this kind of thing that has been a theme throughout all of these different parts. So with anti-Black racism, with anti-Asian racism, with discrimination against LGBTQ, it's all at its heart one of colonialism and greed, that it creates this system that breaks up people from banding together, that it keeps the wealthy as wealthy and the poor as poor. And it does that by not giving them any kind of incentive or ability to band together to help one another. This is in the mainland, and I think in Hawaii, it'd probably be more appropriate to say that this is the root of ethnic discrimination, where ethnic discrimination in Hawaii is, again, it started out as colonialism. I mean, there's a lot in my head right now, and it could actually be not really colonialism, but I guess imperialism, because the state of Hawaii is occupied by the United States. It wasn't annexed legally. And so like there's that whole other thing in my head about, like the Bayonet Constitution, the Great Mahele, like all these things that are coming out. But anyway, so all these things that I could give another presentation on. Either way, it started out with people coming into the kingdom of Hawaii with greed and creating the system on the plantations, which resulted in wealth for, people in these Big Five, but not anything else for anyone else. And they did it by turning those who would benefit from banding together against each other. And we're still seeing the repercussions of that happening today. So I wanted to close now with bringing it back to this idea of karma, where again, I think with the history of plantations in Hawaii, it's very easy to see how the Japanese people were in a very terrible position, when they got there. They were under horrible conditions and were able to pull themselves out of it, which is fantastic. It's great for Japanese Americans. But looking at where you are now, looking at the people around you and recognizing that there still is inequality in the islands, we see that it's not just, me and them, us and those people, our group and their group, but, we're all here together. And so to shatter that kind of ego or the duality and recognize that we were in the same position, we might be in the same position in the future. And so really the thing that we should do is to help out those who are disadvantaged. And by doing that, of course, we're helping other people, but in the same way, we're helping ourselves. That compassion to others, ultimately compassion to oneself. So I hope that this kind of concept, that this mentality, this Buddhist teaching is what helps guide when we think about things that are happening to people, when there's inequality that we see, and all the different kinds of ways what we can do to help other people. So I'm not really sure if you read the Golden Chain in Hawaii, but I know that was created actually in Hawaii by Ernest Hunt, probably more so by his wife Dorothy Hunt. But when you say like you should be kind and gentle to every living being, especially the ones who are weaker than myself, then when we think about weak, what does that mean? And a lot of times it can mean, within this greater context, people who are not doing so well because of these institutionalized things. And what are you doing to protect them? What are you doing to help them? What are you doing to make their lives better? And again, since we're all in that golden chain, when you help one, you're helping all, you're helping yourself. So in the same way, I guess you could think of it in a selfish way, but ultimately it's not that there's this you and I, but we're all here together. And so we should all be taking care of each other. Okay, that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Matt. Let's please give Reverend Matt a virtual round of applause. Did you say that you studied the history of Hawaii for 4 days?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
You must have been burning the candle at both ends, because that was very informative. Thanks very much for that, for integrating that material into your presentation. Really grateful for that. So everyone that's present, I want to announce that we are going to give you all a 5-minute break to stretch and refresh yourselves. So please feel free to take advantage of that. When we come back, during the break, you're welcome to unmute and chat openly. We will be turning off the recording feature during the break, so you don't need to be as worried about that. And when we come back, our other facilitator, Koki, will introduce herself, and we'll get underway with the Q&A session for Reverend Matt, and hopefully we'll have some time for folks to share some experiences that have been shared with us already, and perhaps even more time than that. So 5-minute break starts now.
We'll move into the Q&A session, but first I'd like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Koki Atchison. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a graduate of Pacific Buddhist Academy back in 2015. And then now I work in invasive species outreach, but my family is pretty involved with the temple, and I'm very grateful to be part of this community. Just as grateful as I am to have the invitation to help to facilitate this session today. And to meet Reverend Matt kind of in this virtual setting, because I've been involved with the Young Buddhist editorial, and I know that Reverend Matt has really supported that work and is a good friend of the president, Devin Matsumoto, of that organization. So as everyone has shared as well, Reverend Matt, thank you so much for delivering a talk that covered such vast topics and putting it so succinctly right on time too, finishing. It's pretty incredible that you're able to integrate all of that new Hawaiian history based on the comment in just the past 4 days. So for this Q&A section, some of the questions were submitted in advance when participants registered. And I think that you did a great job, Reverend Matt, of addressing many of them. So we'll plan to start with the questions that were posted in the chat for those participants who are here, and then move through some questions that could use a little bit more of your insight here going forward. So we'll spend about 30 minutes on this Q&A session, and then move into some experience sharing from volunteers who were willing to share their experiences with discrimination. So a question that came up in the chat that we'll start off with here. Scroll up as we've had a lot of direct message communication here. So yeah, from Richard Ito, what are your thoughts on the role of Buddhist churches during plantation days through today?
That's a good question. I don't really have a good answer for it. my limited research, I wasn't able to look too much into the plantation churches, except that they were allowed to create them to kind of continue to foster like this separate kind of ethnicities. But if it's anything like parallel to the churches that were built on the mainland, it helped to like have this spiritual center for people when they had hard times, especially when people would die. But then also serves as a cultural center for people to come and bond with each other, kind of like being in this home away from home, being able to pass down certain traditions. So I mean, like I imagine it's something like that. But from what I understand, in Hawaii, a lot of those plantation temples are starting to close up because everyone has moved off of the plantation, so it's hard to have like people around them. So I mean that's another one of the unfortunate things that's been happening recently, but hopefully there can be still a presence of Jodo Shinshu in Hawaii in some way.
Yeah, thank you. So participants, please feel free to include more questions into the chat and we'll cover those as they come up. But we'll cover the pre-submitted questions as well now. So I'll start off with the first one and then Mr. Josh and I will be alternating for the rest. So this question is kind of about the scope of your talk. So these subtopics could each take years to thoroughly discuss. What are the advantages and challenges to discussing race, gender, sexual orientation, and more in just one talk?
So it is really hard to talk about such big topics. I mean, there's entire like academic fields built to like each one of those things, right? You can have departments at universities that cover each one of those things. But I think it's important to have the conversation, even if it's, for a short amount of time, because then it makes people aware of these issues and then hopefully sparks them to look up something on their own. So, I mean, kind of like with like going to church or something on Sunday, right? The talk isn't that long, but then hopefully it sparks something that people, they want to research a little more in their own free time. And so the same way, hopefully this is kind of like opening a door or like opening a window that people can start to do their own kind of work on it to make some kind of change.
Thank you, Reverend Matt, for the inspiration. I agree with you. I think being introduced to a talk like this hopefully does inspire additional action on the part of the participants here. Another question that was posed by a participant previously started off with a statement, and it says that the Heart Sutra teaches us to be compassionate to every sentient being. How do we remain compassionate to those who discriminate against these communities?
Yeah, so that was one I tried to answer directly in the presentation, where like instead of trying to focus on the people who are doing the hate, creating the violence, like we should be focusing on those who are disadvantaged. Because if you argue with someone who's trying to perpetuate those kind of things, who says hateful things, you can't like reason with them into not feeling that way. I don't know if anyone's tried to argue with somebody in that way, but it doesn't really work. And so instead of essentially wasting your breath or energy, you should focus on something else. And also, I mean, if you did want to focus on them, like I mentioned, the compassion thing would be to forgive them, recognizing that wherever they come from, their causes and conditions, their circumstances, had them be a certain way. And so, who's to say that if we were in the same position and grew up in the same way, that we wouldn't also feel those kind of things. And so recognizing that we are all subject to our own upbringing, that to the compassionate thing would be to forgive them for whatever happened in their life, whoever hurt them, whatever that caused them to feel a certain way. And so that would be one way of showing compassion, to forgive, and it also stops that negative karma from being perpetuated.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is one that people just are still trying to wrap their head around. I'll call your attention to this question in the chat as a follow-up from Alan Kubota. The word forgive to me more Christian term, was used as a description in the presentation on karma. Do you also understand it to mean understand?
I'm sorry, what? That was kind of confusing to me.
Okay. Yeah, let me try to paraphrase. So the word forgive,
Forgive. Okay.
forgive was used in your presentation on karma.
Mhm.
Does forgive also mean to understand?
Yeah. So as I kind of mentioned, as I was explaining, like to understand that we're all products of the past karma that we had. So if someone wasn't lucky enough to grow up where we grew up, have the teachers that we had the role models that we had, what kind of person would end up they being, and is that even their fault, right? And so like to truly understand another person, in my opinion, is to put yourself in their shoes completely, so much that there's nothing separating you two, that you can essentially be that person. And once you get to that point, which is very difficult, but to do that would be to really truly understand where they're coming from. I mean, you can hear their argument or whatever, and that's only take you so far, really, on the surface. But if you understand like their life, what caused them to be the way they are, then that's when I think you can really truly forgive someone, when you actually understand. But it doesn't mean that you have to get it that far to forgive somebody. You can definitely just hear what they say and then decide to forgive them about it, and then move on with your life. But I mean, to really get in there is to actually understand where they're coming from.
And the person who asked this question added on "and accept" as well. So perhaps those two work together.
Yeah. So like to not even accept them as like a different person, but accept them as, like you. Like if I was in the same position, then I would be the same way. And so I accept who you are because I understand where you've come from.
Mr. Josh, you want to go back to the list of questions now then?
Sure. Thank you. So this next question is kind of there's a four-parter, but I'm gonna jump into kind of the middle of it. And well, the opening, Sao, is what is mindfulness? But then there are a couple of follow-up questions, and maybe I don't know how you want to approach these, but the follow-up questions are: what does the Dharma say about community involvement? And does the Dharma say anything about human rights and the merits of those, if they are addressed by the Dharma?
Yeah, so I not like for the last two, not really too much like explicitly, about like human rights or something, but there definitely is this understanding of like equality, I suppose, which the Buddha taught. So during the Buddha's time, it was in India where they had a very strict caste system, where there's like the Brahmin on top and then like the untouchables on the bottom. And so the Buddha argued that there's really nothing that makes Brahmins better than anyone else. There isn't that makes the untouchables worse than anybody else. It's all life, and we should all be grateful and compassionate for. And so this, I think that question and maybe this understanding is kind of what led me into using karma as an example, because that's essentially where they thought that the higher or lower birth came from, was from karma generated in a previous life. However, what the Buddha said is what's important is the action that you take in this moment now, regardless of what happened in your past, what happened in anyone else's past. And so mindfulness would be being mindful of that kind of concept, of being mindful of those around you, being mindful of not necessarily what their past, but in spite of their past or whatever their past was, what are you doing now in the present to affect the future? And I think that goes along with human rights, where what is it that you're doing with your action right now? Every day, every moment, we have the choice to do an action, right? Whatever it is. If we want to get up, we want to go to work, if we want to give money, if we want to buy something, like all of these are choices that we are doing, which causes action, which eventually makes up who we are and the lives that we live. And so if what's important for us is being mindful and making actions that will benefit the world, then absolutely we have to be thinking about human rights, even if it isn't explicitly stated by the Buddha, because he really talked about how it was important for the sense of equality among all beings.
Thank you. I think as another component to the human rights, the kind of institutional, the role of the Honganji, there's two questions that I think we could combine here next. One from Dexter in the chat. Is there a role for Honganji in nurturing Asian American Buddhists in a general way and not a conversion to Jodo Shinshu way? And he references the Be the Refuge book by Chen Sting Han.
Okay, I know the book, I haven't read it yet. I'm too busy studying Hawaii. But so the role in Honganji nurturing Asian American Buddhists in a general way. I don't suppose you know what that means, Koki.
I think my interpretation was the identity of Asian American Buddhists outside of a specific sect or temple affiliation. But Dexter, if you want to unmute and add more context to that question, please feel free.
Yeah, hi, Matt. Thanks for sharing your perspectives with us. The book, The Asian American Buddhist, it's basically about young Asian American Buddhist, and Chenzing did a survey of about 80, I think, different young Buddhists, but they're all of different ethnicities and different Buddhist paths. And so I'm wondering, from our Honganji perspective, we focus on our teachings quite a bit. This broader kind of generation of Buddhists are, they're all over the map, but they're Buddhist. We tend to be, very, tightly knit sometimes, with our perspective on Buddhist teachings. Can we, embrace kind of a larger audience? And maybe you do that, in BCA and in Sacramento, but I think it's be something kind of new for us here in Hawaii.
Okay. Oh, okay. That's a very interesting question. Let's see. Yeah, I'd have to speak on perhaps like the BCA, how we would see it. And it really depends on the minister. So, certain ministers are very hardline. This is the Honganji way, like this is what we teach. Other ministers are very, very open about accepting different things and different ways to teach or different faiths to reflect. And so that's, one thing in terms of like how people reach out, is that it's really dependent on the minister. For my own personal appreciation, I feel like it's important for the minister as a teacher, and then also, I guess, the members as people who perhaps are trying to get more members to really understand the Jodo Shinshu teaching. And when you really understand the heart of it, then you can open up to other things, because where home is, like where you come from, and like you can relate in that way. If you are kind of unsure about Jodo Shinshu, then I would advise against like trying to focus on other things, because then you kind of get lost. But if you have that kind of as your guiding light, then it allows you to, I think, explore different things, whether it's other Buddhist traditions, other faiths, or whatever. Like some of the most interesting and like inspired people I've seen who are Jodo Shinshu really identify or understand other forms of Buddhism or religions, and it strengthens their understanding of Jodo Shinshu, being able to see it from different ways, different lenses. So I think absolutely it could be a strength to incorporate the different things as long as you have a real strong foundation.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend Matt. That's very resonant with me, having that home identity, the guiding principles that you can come back to. Another question about Honganji from submitted questions earlier. How might Honganji temples turn concern into relevant action? Anything else that you'd want to elaborate on from that gratitude into action?
Gratitude into action.
So yeah, the question was about turning concern into relevant action.
Yeah, that's something I've been struggling with because of all of these issues, coming to light. Like what can I do in the community to help? And I thought about it a lot, and it was very discouraging because it's like, to make any real lasting change, you have to have these huge things, that are overturned. And so like it was very discouraging to me. But then I kind of came back down to earth and just like looking around, my city, just being like, what is it in Sacramento that we can do? Who are some organizations that we can partner up with, that we can talk to, that we can offer our support to? What are some things that are tangible that we can strive for, just to make our community a little bit better? And I think that's a real easy way to start, to start looking to where we can make a tangible impact in this world. And it has to start small, right? You can't start with this huge thing, and hopefully eventually you start to get the ball rolling, get people involved, and then you can start to see some wider changes, maybe not just in a community, but widespread. But I think that's where it starts, is you see within your power what it is that you can do, what it is that you can volunteer, donate, whatever it is that you have in your life that you can give to something or someone, some kind of organization, something that like we can come together to help other people. That's like a great way, I think, to start.
So I think I have, and I might be combining, hopefully my co-moderator, Koki, is cool with this, but I'm going to try and combine a couple different questions that connect with what you just said. And I'll start off with an observation that one of the persons participating pre-submitted that stated regarding our temples seem foreign, mystical, and unusual, with leaders that are shy and unassuming and not embracing and accepting. So some questions that follow on that observation. First, are we making the right efforts to teach everyone acceptance of individuals as they are? And then dialing down into that, what specifically are Buddhist churches in the US doing to make their temples and the Dharma more inclusive and or representative to underrepresented groups?
In terms of like inclusion, I know on the LGBTQ front, at least in the BCA, there was a presentation that was given about language or signage or something that you can put in your temple saying, we welcome all people. And then you could even be specific in terms of, regardless of like race, sexual orientation. And that's one like physical way to do it. In terms of, like being shy, that's a good question. I'm not, we should have some kind of like training for greeters or something like that, maybe. I don't know. We, as a temple, we had kind of this, I don't know, spy project or something where a bunch of us went to this like mega church that exists. And so like, that was really eye-opening, because like all the people that were outside, welcome people, they were all young. They had like Cheetos, they have like these bags of chips they would give to you, and like, oh, you need help, I go sit by you, like we do stuff. So like it's possible, right, to have that kind of like welcoming atmosphere. As far as the temples looking mystical and foreign, I think a lot of times we forget that these were cultural centers for the majority of the time that they've been in America. Only recently, at least in the BCA, have we started focusing exclusively on the Buddhism. And so I think that's something that we should respect and continue in such a way, because from what I've heard from people who have come to temple for the first time or people who have become members, they kind of like that aspect of it, that it's different. They like the chanting, that they like some of the inclusion of Japanese. And actually some of the similar things is what turns people off, right? Like when you get people who come from like a Christian background and they're like, oh yeah, that was kind of close to like the services that we had. I didn't like it. So like, I think embracing and being very comfortable with who we are, where we come from, understanding, like, and you don't have to be Japanese American to appreciate it, like any kind of ethnicity to understand where we come from, to respect that history and then have it inform, where we go from there. So like, you don't have to be like, well, like this is how we did it, and so that's how we're going to do it. But like, oh, this is why we do things. This is why this is how it is. And now like we can make this conscious choice to, oh, well, we want to change it, or we want to keep it, or we want to emphasize it, right? So there's a lot of things like the bonodori, which is traditionally Japanese, like the taiko drumming, like there's different things where we can take cultural aspects and include it in the temples, while it isn't necessarily Buddhist that attracts people. And of course you want to emphasize the Buddhism as well, but ultimately, I mean, to me, the most important aspect of any sangha is the community. Is otherwise, you could just read a book by yourself. So like, to have that interaction between people, to have the change in changing of the guard, the passing down of culture, like all that stuff is what's necessary to have a lively and like vibrant sangha. And so, like if it seems mystical, then explain it. If people are shy, then help them be more open. And I don't know what it takes to get more confidence, learning more about Buddhism, about the services, maybe going to Toastmasters, I don't know, something. But like, if you see these problems, then I think that's what we got to start looking at. It's like, okay, well, how do we demystify? How do we get people out there? How do we seem more welcoming? How do we reach out to communities that potentially might be interested? Or how do we reach out to our own community that has kind of fallen off for a while? So just these kind of issues, I think are all temples we have, and we got to just look at all of them and see what it is that we can do to help, I guess, explain to ourselves and to others, to hopefully help them understand why we do the things we do.
Yeah, thank you. So as we're running out of time with question and answer, I just want to cover one more question that came in the chat. In reading this, I don't know what my response would be either. So it I can let you read it too. But yeah, would you be willing to discuss this question, knowing that in the past 4 days, you've done a lot of research on Hawaii? But I would also be curious, since this is something that I would like to see our temples in Hawaii do more, moving towards a way of being that doesn't contribute to additional colonization. And I'd also be curious to see your perspective from your home temple as well, if Hawaii is too much to cover in this session.
Yes. Okay. So I'm not it doesn't show the ongoing colonization for First Nations people. Yeah. So I think the first thing is to learn. So to put the onus on the Hawaiian people to teach about their past or their culture is a bit unfair, right, as they're suffering enough. And so this was something that kind of parallels my research on anti Black colonialism and decolonizing, that kind of thought process of like, it's too much to ask of Black people to educate everyone about it. So the first thing I think is we need to educate ourselves and, you know, each other, if that's helpful, on how on these issues, the terms of the, you know, occupation of Hawaii, of colonization, and then with that, you know, first step, then you can start looking at these avenues of change, right? I mean, like colonization, you kind of have to decolonize your mind, because we have a way of thinking and accepting things as they have been, as they are, as normal, when, you know, perhaps it isn't normal. And so like that, it was the kind of glass shattering effect for me researching and then learning, you know, like it's like, oh yeah, Hawaiians didn't understand this concept of like working for someone else and then they get all the profit and you don't get anything. Or it's like, well, yeah, as Americans, we just accept that, but what a silly thing to think. So like that kind of mentality, you know, I only would have gotten through my research. And so like understanding the different things that led to the annexation, you know, from like King Kamehameha III, dividing up, you know, the land into the three parts, and then eventually having the bayonet constitution, King Kalakaua having to sign it over, and then, you know, Queen Liliuokalani like having to eventually give up to protect essentially her people, when you have the superior military might of the United States. But like if we can learn why all those things happen, how they happened, then, you know, we can start thinking about undoing it. But that's a really tricky question, because I was kind of at the end of where I was like looking into it, because there are people who are fighting for it. There is a, you know, sovereign nation movement going on in Hawaii, and then what that would look like is not completely clear, but essentially like occupation can only end with a treaty of peace. Once a treaty of peace is signed, then the laws of the Kingdom of Hawaii are enforced and not the laws of the United States. However, it's like tricky to find something like that because of the process of Americanization of the Hawaiians, you know, going like so far as to banning any kind of teaching of the Hawaiian language in schools, which was severely punished if they learned any of it. So getting rid of, you know, the language by that process. And there's, you know, many other different things that they use to try to get rid of any kind of connection to the culture in over 100 years. So this is the longest any country has been occupied. And it was like, I think that was something for me too, that I, as foolish as it sounds, I didn't realize that Hawaii was a country like before. So like there was an argument that we shouldn't say that Hawaii is indigenous land, because it was a internationally recognized country. So they had treaties with, or recognition from other countries, because they had import exports, they had recognition. And so like they were an international country, the Kingdom of Hawaii, before they were annexed by the United States. And well, not annexed, illegally annexed, I guess, because even in America, people were against it. But anyway, so then I guess this whole other idea of US military imperialism all over the world. We are an empire, but we somehow lie to ourselves and say that we're not, even though we have military bases all over the world. I'm not sure what that's about. Anyway, so there's all these different things that come up, but it only becomes something that you think about if you like actually look into it. Okay, let's see. It is a nation, represents the UN, nations in the US. So exactly right. So there's no peace treaty in the US or between the US and the Kingdom of Hawaii, so it's still occupied. And so they send people to the UN every year. You know, as in terms of what the UN can really do about it, it's hard to say, because they're not, you know, they don't have an army. They can't like force anyone to do anything. It's really up to the United States to kind of come to its senses and recognize, like, and so there was the apology that was given, I forget what year it was, but the apology that was issued by the United States, and that essentially doesn't mean anything, because the words whereas, I guess, like nullify that it means anything. And then also like an apology is not a peace treaty, and thus it doesn't end the occupation of Hawaii. And I mean, really, it doesn't do anything for anyone, just saying sorry, right? So I don't know, long-winded answer. There's really the first step is learning, and then perhaps looking into the different organizations. I know you have some organizations listed that you're possible to donate to, but then looking into the sovereign movement and seeing what it is that you can do to help out with any of those organizations. So I mean, like letting them lead, that was one of the big things. It was like, yeah, do your own reading, but then let them lead. So then allow them to lead the charge for the sovereign nation.
Thank you, Reverend Matt, for all of your really insightful answers to all these questions, and truly especially for pivoting on a dime to include so much more Hawaiian history into your talk. I can't say enough about how much I appreciate that truth being spoken today, and from the comments here coming in as well. So now I'd like to turn it over back to Josh, who will introduce experience sharing.
Thanks, Koki, and thank you, Reverend Matt, and to everyone who has been contributing questions. One of the things in preparation for this seminar today that that Auntie Debbie asked individuals and the other organizers asked individuals to contribute if they were interested was to share experiences of discrimination that you have been witness to or experienced in your own lives. And so we have those experiences collected here, and what we'll do is, I guess, I want to verify that the individuals contributing these experiences are still welcome us reading these aloud. And so I think the practice will be that I will request the permission of the individual whose experience I will share to reauthorize us again. And then I'll read the experience aloud and then give Reverend Matt an opportunity to share some of his insights or thoughts in response. The first participant that we have in our list is Kati Kaufman. Kati, is it okay if I read aloud the experience that you shared with us? Are you with?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, you can read it.
Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate that. So reading this one aloud, it says, as for incidents of gender discrimination, they are so numerous, it's hard to know where to begin. At the University of Washington, Kati shares, I was refused counseling in my pre-med program in 1966 because I was baldly told, women are nurses, men are doctors, go be a nurse. In most professional situations, there was the assumption I was physically available to men. From the time I was 15, and a highly regarded dentist who was a professor at UW wiped his hands numerous times on my dental bib, to many bosses at jobs who routinely groped, and worse, the message is one of power and humiliation over me because I'm female. In my son's generation, this has changed for the better. When I was physically attacked a few years ago in an elevator at the Honolulu Museum of Art, my son encouraged me to report it. My attitude was based on decades of my experience that, quote, it's his word against mine and he'll just say nothing happened. But my son was insistent that things had changed, and he was right. I reported it, and that employee lost his job. It seems like a miracle to me that attitudes have changed this much and that women are believed and more protected now than in the past.
I'm sorry, what was I supposed to do?
Well, so I think maybe if you can share some reactions or some insights that are occasioned by our reading of the experiences that were shared.
Yes, yeah. So first, I wanted to. I'm really sorry to hear the terrible things that have happened. I agree, with your son that things have gotten better, but there's still so much work that we still have to do in terms of gender equality, as well as disrupting rape culture. So like this idea that women, exist for men is part of that rape culture. And so it's again, as I was talking about, like educating ourselves about those other issues, it's important for us to educate ourselves as well. And so personally, for myself, there was this book, Missoula, by John Krakauer. It's about the rape cases in the justice system in this like college town. And so it was in the news like a while back, but it was like, what's going on in this like college town that there's like so many rapes happening. But what the scary thing was is that it was actually kind of like any other college town when the data was collected. And so it really opened my eyes to a lot of the issues with the justice system in terms of it, where as you mentioned, my word versus his, we have made some advancements for sure, but there's a long way to go. And so again, recognizing that there is this problem, and understanding what the problem is helps us to figure out ways to combat it. So I appreciate your sharing that, and I hope we can continue moving forward in that kind of in that way.
Thank you, Reverend Matt, and thank you again, Kati, for your permission to share it with the group. Koki, are we going to pass the baton back and forth still yet on this?
So next year we have Janice Terakawa. Are you present and willing for us to share, to read what you had submitted?
I don't think she's here. I've been scanning the list, so unless she's on one of the iPhones or something, but you can go ahead, Janice. If you're not here, we're going to go ahead.
Okay. So what was submitted was discrimination based on appearance, assumption made that I was not an English speaker.
Yeah, I mean, like that's definitely something. I mean, we feel on the mainland where people look at like Asians and think that they don't necessarily speak English off the back, and I don't know. One of the like kind of silly questions I think I've gotten growing up is like, oh yeah, where are you from? We're like, oh yeah, I'm from Berkeley, I'm from the Bay Area. Like, no, where are you actually from? I don't know, like on Ashby, like the hills. What do you want me to say? And it's like, but they're asking, your country of origin, and so like that's they're trying to ask what your ethnicity is. And I mean, like one time this guy asked me like McDonald's, well, I was like, just give me my fries, man. Like I don't, but that they're thinking about that because that's what they see versus seeing you as a person, and even they're ignorant of the history of your people, because like on my dad's side I'm Yonsei, so like fourth generation. On my mom's side I'm first generation because she's from the Philippines, but people don't recognize that Chinese and Japanese people have been on the mainland for over 100 years, and a lot of them speak well better English than I do, so like pretty good. But that is definitely something that we deal with as forever foreigners, is what's it's often referenced as. They see Asian people and they think that they're foreigners, even though we've been here for so long. And so like there's different ways people have tried to combat this, whether it's proving how American you are or whatever, but ultimately none of that is going to change anyone's mind. So we just have to be like comfortable in our own skin. And I guess, like, yeah, my English is pretty good or something you could say to them. But I think I get that question a lot because I'm a minister. And so a lot of people think that the ministers are from Japan. It's like, wow, your English is really good. I say, oh, well, I'm studying it for, 30 years. So.
I was going to make a wisecrack, but I'm going to refrain from making a wisecrack. So thank you for your response. I want to ask Sandra Togashi. Is it okay if we share the experience that you relate?
Aloha, yes.
Thank you. Really interesting comment. She wrote, growing up, I experienced a dual lifestyle during the week compared to the weekends. I faced and also overcame discrimination growing up in a predominantly Caucasian, Protestant, Republican community in Southern California. Few people look like me. Attending school in my home community, I tended to feel different, very unlike my peers in basic values. Insightfully, my parents and families raised us at the Orange County Buddhist Church in Anaheim, where the Sangha community instilled the Buddha's Dharma, promoted volunteerism for the greater good purposes, organized extracurricular athletic and social activities, and offered a place of belonging among Asian Americans.
Thank you. Yeah, you wouldn't be related to Allison Togashi, are you?
Yes, I am. She's my niece.
Oh, okay.
My
Yeah.
brothers are Calvin and Richard.
Okay, because yeah, so there was a youth program in Sacramento where we both went through. So I essentially lived with her for like a week, and then my wife's from Orange County, so she knows her too. But yeah, and I had kind of touched on this a little bit on the purpose of the temples, in that they were kind of this safe haven from discrimination for the Japanese people. So like being growing up with extreme racism, in the Issei and then even the Nisei generations, it helped to shield them from that, for a place where they felt comfortable. And then, even later, even though it might not be so like, I don't know, explicit or something, but like the racism discrimination is still there. And so our churches are important because they do act as a place where we feel like we belong. And so like as we see the temple demographic starting to change, right, with intermarriage, with accepting of other people into the temple leadership positions, it'll be interesting to see from here where we go, if it still is a place that Japanese American people find that kind of refuge. I know a lot of Japanese American families end up not going to temple because they feel okay, they're comfortable in their community, they don't need like some kind of place to shield themselves from discrimination. And so that's also something interesting to kind of like look out for, which I've noticed. So I'm very happy that you're able to find this safe place in the temple. I hope it continues to be that way. But the question becomes for who and from what.
Yeah, thank you. For our next person who submitted, Kira Rain Guerrero, are you still on the call? I just chatted this to you too, but if you'd like, I can read this for you, or if you prefer to read it yourself, I can chat it to you so you have it to reference.
I was replying and I realized I saved it. I sent it to the wrong person. So I would not mind at all reading. That would be an honor, but whatever's best for the event.
Yeah, please go ahead. I think it'll be better from your own voice if you're happy to do it.
Although you have a lovely speaking voice.
It's not letting me copy and paste. So
it's okay. I can speak from the heart. I remember basically just sharing that I was a proud member of the Chungtai Buddhist monastery branch in Houston. And from the moment I walked in, regardless that I myself am a Black woman of Japanese and Mexican descent who also identifies as a lesbian in the LGBTQ community, that was never, ever an issue anytime I was within that temple. And so my look on Buddhism is one because of my personal experience that is very accepting, very opening. There is no closed-mindedness, very welcoming. So I just wanted to share that I don't have specific instances of discrimination because my life as a person in every kind of disadvantaged community, I feel, has daily experiences. But I very much wanted to extend a sense of gratitude towards my experiences with Buddhism's temples and leaders within Buddhist communities, the Sangha. And the last thing was that I wrote down in case I shared was that I'm very cognizant that my ancestors of every kind of descent and origin did not have the opportunity to experience the amount of freedoms that I do today, to get education, to be a part of an entire different country's event like this. So that kind of compassion to myself and remembering that is what helps me be compassionate to those who are spreading hate. That was my question as well. Like, how am I nice or compassionate to people who are actively spreading hate? And you answered that. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for just allowing me to observe and witness this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for attending. And I think being able to have, a lot of different people attend these kind of events is very important, because we learn from each other so much. I know I'm supposed to be like the teacher or whatever, but like I learned so much from interacting with all the people in the temple and the events that we have, and it really makes it better for me. And so I'm glad you've had that experience in the Buddhist temples, because for sure that's not every experience. Like, there's definitely people who come unfortunately to some of the Jodo Shinshu temples, at least on the mainland, and they're kind of shunned because they're not Japanese American. And so I'm glad that you were able to. It kind of reminds me of this story. So I'd be kind of remiss if I told it myself, but I guess it's kind of this plug for my podcast, which I'm trying to get better at like promoting. But anyway, so I have this podcast, the Welcome Matt's podcast, because I do it with another member of our temple, Matt Nita. And so we both have the first name Matt, so it's Welcome Matt. But anyway, we had a guest on, Eli, who is a Black transgender man. And so he interacted with Buddhism through his Aikido practice. And it's very heavily influenced through Zen. And so like he has a very deep connection to the Buddhist community, as well as the Heart Sutra. And so like it reminds me of that, because they were so accepting to him. They didn't care where he was from or what he looked like or whatever, but they were like, what, you need this discipline, like you need this in your life, like fine, we'll give that. So I'm glad to hear that you're able to have that kind of experience.
Yeah, exactly the same. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kira, for being here. So wonderful that you found this event, and you feel like you've been included. And I'm really happy that Reverend Matt was able to speak back to your experience a little bit. I am mindful that we have many other participants that contributed experiences that we might have been able to share, but I'm mindful that we need to respect Reverend Matt's time. He has other events in his day that he needs to turn to. So I am going to begin the closing proceedings. What I want to do is I want to thank Reverend Matt so much for your presentation on behalf of the Honolulu and Oahu Hongaji Councils and the Office of Buddhist Education. So impressed with the previous research that you've done, the additional work that you did to put it in a context that's more relevant for our membership here, for our participants here, and so grateful that you were able to share your information, and hopefully look forward to meeting you some point in the future. I want to thank all of the attendees that were present here. It's a Saturday, and it's great to see you all, and so I'm grateful for that also. I want to please thank the Honolulu and Oahu District Buddhist Education Committee for planning and coordinating the seminar. I want to let you know that a recording of the seminar will be posted and emailed to all of the registered participants about 2 weeks after the seminar, or sooner, if they get that information compiled before then. And want to let you know also that a short evaluation of the seminar will be emailed to all of you after the seminar's conclusion. The committee would really appreciate it if you can fill out that survey. I know it's tough to get back to these things, but it would be really helpful information, because they want to help plan future seminars that will be relevant to all of you. I think you will have seen that there's a couple links that have been shared in the chat. Is that the Spotify link, Reverend Fujimoto? Is that to Reverend Matt's podcast?
Yes, the first one is through, what is that, iTunes? And the second one is through Spotify.
Great. Thanks so much. And I'm glad that you remembered to promote it. And thanks very much for the links also, Reverend Fujimoto. If I can ask Reverend Fujimoto to please lead us in the reciting of the Nembutsu.
Before I do that, I think some people were notified that they were recipients of Bishop Marvin Harada's book. Wait, do I have? Oh, well, if you guys can see this. Rick Oishi from Orange County Buddhist Church, Donna Higashi from Wailili Honganji, Sandra Togashi from Hawaii Betsueng, Dexter Marr from Hawaii Betsueng, Koki Atchison. Hey, I don't know about that one, from Hawaii Betsueng, and Ro Onishi, also from Orange Buddhist County Temple. You all received a book, and so if you could reply to the email to send us your mailing address so we can get that book out to you. Other than that, please join me in with your palms put together and let us together recite the Nembutsu. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Namo.
All right, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining here, for the planning committee, and for Reverend Matt for delivering such an excellent talk. Lots to think ahead to, and lots of actions to move on and thinking about how we can implement that in our temples. So would like to wish everyone a great rest of your day. And please, keep an eye out for those email reminders for evaluations.
So everyone, that's a wrap.